So today we're here to have a little bit discussion about Dr. Mark Baker's book, Pivot of China, Spatial Politics and Inequality in Modern Zhengzhou. I'm Amy Zhang. I'm a lecturer in urban planning at the University of Manchester. I'm here to sort of ask Dr. Mark Baker some questions about the book and hopefully give you a little bit overview of what the book covers. And then we will have some time to ask questions for the audience at the end. So as the introduction of the speaker, Dr. Mark Baker is a lecturer in East Asian history at the University of Manchester. His research focuses on history of modern China and its global connection. And in addition to the book, which was published in 2004, he has also published on a range of topics from 1940s China, including the Chinese Civil War, transport in Northwest China, children and young people under Japanese occupation. Right, so I guess we'll get this started. So I read this book for the past couple weeks/months. It's a very long, extended period of time in addition to doing other things. I have to say, obviously, I'm not a historian. I'm trained as a geographer, so when I was reading this book, what I found particularly interesting is, as a geographer reading this book, of looking at the spatial elements through a historical lens, which I find extremely interesting, and also very much appreciate Mark's engagement with geographers' work, especially in the introduction, which some of this will be brought up in our subsequent questions and conversations as well. But in addition, I think what I find most interesting is to see how a pattern of inequality, spatial inequality and spatial politics sort of continued from the early 1910s all the way to the contemporary time. So I think that will be another kind of key theme that we will try to touch upon throughout the questions today. And obviously, for those of you who haven't read the book, if you're particularly interested in a particular period of time, obviously feel free to ask Mark at the end. Right, so I think perhaps we can start with a very kind of obvious question almost, that I think for those of us who study China in this room, Zhengzhou may not necessarily be a city that is our first choice in terms of research. So I guess the first question really is why did you choose to study Zhengzhou? What really makes it interesting to you?
Great. I should probably start by saying that this book is based on my PhD dissertation. But when I started graduate school, I really had no idea what it was that I was supposed to be doing or what I was trying to research. I was actually admitted to graduate school with a view to doing some kind of research project on the last 20 or 25 years of the Qing period, on the frontiers, thinking about very late Qing and Xinjiang period state building in the late 19th, early 20th century. And I was trying to get some sort of project going on that when I realized that I was just somehow ill-equipped to write about the frontiers of the Qing Empire when I really felt like I didn't know anything about the middle of it. And this was brought home to me just in very casually visiting a few friends around China in the first summer of my graduate school. I visited an old friend of mine from Henan, and we did some tourism in Kaifeng, Luoyang, and spent time in the provincial capital just for a couple of days in Zhengzhou. And I was struck probably by three things. The first one was that there was this vast city that I'd probably traveled through on the train maybe 10 times and just had no idea of anything about it, what had happened there in the past, what was happening there now. And I think that was the moment when I realized that I wanted to really get to grips with this kind of provincial, middle, inland China more than the frontiers. The second thing that struck me was the contrast between the two cities that I ended up writing about, the contrast between Zhengzhou and Kaifeng. I guess there's kind of a personal psychobiography in that I'm from the city of York. I'd spent all my life in York, really, and which is a railway town, a railway junction town. My family had been working on the railways for a long time. but is also a tourist town, like Kaifeng is a sort of walled medieval city. So maybe there was something of my own hometown in both of these cities, but they just felt like very different places to visit as a casual visitor. And I suppose the third thing that struck me was the contrast between both urban centres and the very rapidly changing countryside in between. These are two cities quite close to each other, but with very fast-changing countryside in Zhengzhou County in between. So those were the three things that struck me just as a tourist, really. And I went on over the next few years to write a dissertation going from about 1900 to about 1960, comparing and connecting these two neighbouring cities. But when it came to the process of turning the dissertation into a book, I realised that actually writing a book about two cities, it was just getting a bit too much, a bit too big, really, a bit too much to juggle. And I also realised that stopping the story in 1960 was a bit random. It was a kind of arbitrary stopping point. I mean, I basically stopped writing because I needed to finish. And a couple of colleagues encouraged me to take the story all the way through from the 1960s all the way pretty much to the present day. And I realised I just couldn't do that with two cities. So I had to choose which one of these cities to focus on. I decided in the end that we might come to this in a moment, but the kind of city that Zhengzhou is might be the most interesting to write about and contribute the most to thinking about urban history in China's 20th century.
Thank you. I mean, it's a very extremely interesting insight into the kind of personal connection with the project, but also, I guess, the struggle about choosing a topic for your dissertation in grad school is something that a lot of us have shared, and also how this art turned to be, how it ended, and how now when you have to turn it into a book, it becomes something that's had to be slightly modified. Extremely, I think, a lot of of us have shared that. So I guess in kind of follow on from that, so that you ended up do choose Zhengzhou as the focus. So in a way that you sort of characterize it as the pivot of China. So from your perspective, what do you mean when you say it's a pivot of China? Like, what does the term mean, and why do you think Zhengzhou is the pivot of China?
Yeah, the book publisher tried to get me to change the title on the grounds that there was nothing. There was no word in the title that was self-explanatory. Every word in the title needs some explanation, including the first word, this pivot. And I suppose pivot has two meanings, really. One is the sense of pivot being the center that things move around, and the other, more colloquially, the sense of pivot as meaning importance. And that two meanings of pivot grapples with the sense in which there's an ordinariness and a specialness to the city of Zhengzhou. The specialness coming from this very sudden status at the beginning of the 20th century as a railway junction, which sets the city up to be a commercial centre, if not necessarily an industrial or a political centre. And that's the first of probably three moments in the book or in the history of the city where there's a specialness. So the first one being this decision to make it the railway junction of the north-south and east-west railways. The second moment of specialness is the decision to move the provincial capital in the 1950s from Kaifeng to Zhengzhou. And then again, probably really not until the 2010s, which is when, as part of a regional development strategy, it's decided that there's this whole large, economically underperforming region of kind of inland, north-central China, and it was decided as part of the strategy to make what's called like a national central city, Guojiao Zhongxin Chengshi, to be the center of a city cluster to try and get this whole region going, to try to really concentrate growth in the city with a view to it then spreading outwards. So those are the kind of three moments of specialness or centrality. But then most of the time, in a sense, there's an ordinariness, maybe not exactly a representativeness, but a kind of ordinariness to where there are, probably 7 or 8 now very large inland provincial capitals that play crucial regional roles, but haven't really been written about very much in English. So there's obviously a tension between saying that a city is ordinary and saying that it's special, but I think the word pivot sort of covers both of those things, and there's 2 bits of that. There's an economic bit and a political bit. I think the economic bit is the sense that it's this kind of city which connects different kinds of economy in the 20th century. In the first decades of the railway in North China, that's a connection between a treaty port economy and a inland rural hinterland economy. And then in the socialist period, it's a connection between a state industrial economy and a collective rural economy. And then in the reform period, this becomes the kind of city that connects the booming manufacturing world of the coast and again, a rural hinterland of that is still agriculture and labour and a source of labour throughout the sort of 20 years of the reform period. And then again, with the shift of manufacturing inland, becomes a kind of connection between the most high-tech parts of the Chinese economy and the rest. So in a sense, that's the kind of economic pivot aspect of it. And then the political aspect is this feeling that, and this is very sort of vague, it's so vague it's not in the book, sort of vague feeling that often it's these regional cities that almost determine the fate of different political projects. I started thinking about this when I was thinking about Japanese invasion and occupation in that sense in the context of Kaifeng. I was thinking about it most recently in the context of the 1989 protest movement, where what struck me about the ultimately successful protest movements in Central and Eastern Europe in 1989 was that they started as kind of provincial movements in East Germany or in Romania, in Poland, starting in provincial cities and then moving to the capital. And it struck me that there are many, many differences between the Warsaw Pact countries and China in 1989. But one of the things that struck me was that, although there are, of course, protest movements in provincial cities, it is a kind of quintessentially metropolitan movement. And in a sense, that's this feeling that 1989 never quite captures the middle, and ends in this, I suppose, a kind of confrontation between an urban world of students and intellectuals and some workers and urban people in the capital, and soldiers of rural origin. That could have, if it happened at a different time, that could have been different. If a student movement of 1989 had coincided with something like the Xiaogang reform of state-owned enterprises or something like that, then maybe things would have been very different, and the movement would have felt a bit more, in a sense, a bit more provincial and a bit less distinctly metropolitan. So that's maybe an example where a kind of political movement or a political project that doesn't quite capture regional cities ends up being limited in a way. And there's maybe a few examples of that, either of state projects or so anti-state or outside the state projects. I should probably stop talking. Yeah.
Right. So would you say, I guess maybe as a follow-up to that, would you say that Zhengzhou is not necessarily the pivot of China, but more that it's a representation of a type of city or a type of regional center that maybe all kind of be conceptualized as pure China?
Yeah, probably. I think there is something about the abruptness of suddenly there's a railroad, whereas particularly towards the south of China, it's more a connection of how railways are connecting with existing waterway networks. Whereas, because really, it's so far at the end of the 1800s, there's this whole swathe of Henan province that is really a long way from navigable waterways. Very suddenly, the arrival of the railway and in the 1900s, 1910s, the quite sudden takeoff of industrialization in the cotton sector probably does mean it happens maybe a bit more rapidly. But we could, you could make an equally compelling case for at least 4 or 5 other cities, I'm sure.
Right. So I guess maybe that's, you mentioned a little bit already earlier, but I think I want to maybe say a bit more where you see the kind of the ordinariness of the city, right? Zhengzhou, in a way, is really, like you say it, as an ordinary city. Again, it's not just in the kind of Jenny Robinson sense of like saying every city should be seen as ordinary, but really to see Zhengzhou almost as, almost like as our starting point to say, not necessarily as a place that a lot of people pay attention to or seeing as interesting or important to study. So it's almost, it's this kind of quintessential ordinariness of Zhengzhou as a city, whilst at the same time, as you kind of said, maybe some people would see it as slightly contradictory to say the ordinariness also contributes its status as being seen as a pivot or one of the pivots of China. So to what extent do you see how these two things relate, I guess, the ordinariness of the city and it being potentially seen as a pivot of China connect? So what is the relationship in that? Or why you see the ordinariness contribute or a part of the reason of seeing it as a pivot of China?
Yeah, not sure I've got a very good answer, but one way of thinking about this might be the way that different people come into the city across the 20th century for different reasons. The sense that this is especially in the reform period where the province of Henan gets a kind of bad reputation in some ways. It's sort of at the bottom of the hierarchy. It becomes a kind of emblem of a certain kind of social crisis. But that's, in a sense, an extreme manifestation of something that is kind of quintessentially rural. I'm thinking here in the book talks about this a little bit, this sense of rural crisis at the end of the 1990s and beginning of the 2000s. But actually, as the provincial capital, there's something a little bit different that's going on in Zhengzhou at the time, even though it's not exactly booming. And this links to thinking about where people are coming from. And one of the interesting, it's not unique, but one of the sort of special things is that there's in the second half of the 20th century, there's a kind of meeting point of rural migrants from some really very peripheral places within Henan province and skilled urban workforce in the state sector that has come either from the lower Yangtze region or from Wuhan or places like that. So people, in that sense, there's a pivot of people coming to the city from all over, and it creates, I think, even in the third generation, I suppose, from those 1950s movements, it creates very kind of, I think, a very kind of special, unpretentious culture that maybe feels a little bit different in different parts of the city. One of the things the book doesn't really talk about enough is differences between different neighborhoods. But I think, speaking as a complete outsider, there's something that is very dynamic, that brings things from different parts of China, and is very central without being sort of metropolitan or pretentious. That's slightly vague.
No, that's great. Thank you. So I guess, obviously the book itself, as I start to say, that the way that I really appreciate as a geographer is because it talks about space so much. So what you sort of you cited Dora Massey, which I really appreciate in the introduction, where you sort of use her quote to talk about space itself makes a difference to how society works. So I guess maybe whether you could elaborate on that bit, how you see that actually work, how that manifests in the case of Zhengzhou, whether the particular examples you see that really demonstrate this kind of the role of the space itself really makes a difference on how society works.
Yeah, this in a way is getting to the heart of the spatial politics part of the book title. And it was a term that I grappled with quite a bit. Again, it's not intuitive exactly what it means. And it's partly encouraging the reader to think about how space as this isn't very scientific, but how space as an independent variable is affecting people's, or households, people, individuals, life trajectories across the 20th century. Now, of course, space might be a manifestation of other things. There might be other characteristics, other inequalities, which manifest themselves in spatial differences. And there's plenty of that in the book as well. But I think what the book is trying to think about is how people's lives are changed by where they are, in the simplest sense. And some of that is geographical or environmental. Some of the different areas around the hinterland of the city have really quite different fates depending on just the quality of the soil, how close they are to the Yellow River, or whether they're able to get irrigation and things like that. But there's also a political component to it, which is really thinking about how it is that the Chinese state, 3 or 4 different versions of the Chinese state across modern history, is allocating, distributing resources across space. And this is, part of kind of, the big picture is that the Chinese state is is having a kind of state-led developmentalist project, at least from about the 1920s, on a shoestring budget. They don't have enough money to develop infrastructure everywhere, develop industry everywhere, exploit resources everywhere. So really until the 21st century, these state developmentalist projects are picking and choosing certain sites to try and kickstart the economy as a whole. And it's only really in the last 20 years that the state has been able to play a more equalizing role, distributing resources across space. It no longer needs to just try and back the winners to develop the economy as a whole. So what that means is that this is another reason why it's an interesting place to think about this, is that sometimes the city of Zhengzhou is a winner, and sometimes it's a loser from these different spatial projects. Sometimes the state is backing it, sometimes it's almost completely abandoned and neglected. So there are a couple of extreme examples of this. For example, in the wartime period during the Japanese occupation, we're right on the front line here. The city is about to be captured by the Japanese advance when the Yellow River is cut. The dikes on the Yellow River are cut at Huayankou, and the flood sweeps down and, in a sense, saves the city from Japanese occupation until 1944. But the way that the nationalist state is allocating resources in wartime is about consolidating the rear areas and trying to establish a political and fiscal and social base in the west of China. And really, for understandable reasons, frontline areas and frontline armies are kind of left to fend for themselves. And as many people will know, after 4 or 5 years of this, in 1942, 1943, this is one of the factors that's feeding into the famine that really hits urban and rural areas very badly across the province. So that's a sort of extreme example of neglect. And then in the Great Leap Forward, which feels like a world away from the 1940s, but is only 15 years later, really, there's a very different dynamic where there is a highly spatialized famine on rural-urban lines where I think we tend to think of, or certainly I had tended to think of the Great Leap Forward as, a famine which is really a rural phenomenon and goes right up to the edge of the city. I think it's probably more helpful to think of it in concentric circles where villages close to the city are likely to be protected from the worst effects of famine, particularly close to a provincial capital. And it's really in that outer peripheral areas of the province where places like Xinjiang, where the effects of the famine are most serious. And that's for very directly political reasons, partly to do with decisions of officials, partly to do with areas close to the provincial capital and the industrial centres being protected. So that's a very, the spatial politics of the famine are very, very stark. But of course, that's really a 3-year, 4-year story. There's that much longer story of how spatial politics interacts with the long 60, 70-year history of household registration system and the hukou system, and how the location of individuals can really affect life trajectories in that classification system, even after lots of the most stringent aspects of the hukou system have been relaxed. There's still these sort of intergenerational effects, and there are a couple of stories in the book of 2 generations of migrants from rural parts of the province coming to the provincial capital and working hard for years and years, but unable quite to establish a foothold, because of the difficulty of the hukou system, even in the 2010s as well as in the 90s.
Thank you. Right, so I guess as part of this spatial politics, right, or the spatial inequalities, the pattern that you sort of describe of generations of years of different Chinese states, but as part of this kind of constant theme in that is this constant tension between efforts of concentration versus efforts of equalization, right? There are always some kind of, even though as you say, that the state has, picked winners from time to time, allocated resources, concentrating in certain places versus others, but there's always in the background or at the same time, some kind of efforts or attempts made at equalization, but almost always the end result is the failure of the equalization efforts. It's always end up somehow leading to even more concentration. So I wonder, in a way, what I'm seeing, or maybe just my reading of the book, it feels nothing has changed almost as a pattern from the 1920s and on. There's just constant efforts of concentration trying to be corrected by equalization, not leading to actual equalization, leading to even more concentration. So I guess my question is, to what extent or in what ways that you see this pattern has actually changed from the 1920s and to the 2020s? Has it actually changed? Or maybe it's just my very uncertain reading of it.
I think it has changed, but maybe only in this century. I should maybe start by saying I don't want to. I guess most people in the room haven't. Maybe everyone in the room hasn't read the book. I don't want you to get the impression I'm trying to say that China has a kind of unique problem with inequality or spatial differences. There's maybe an argument that this phenomenon of people's life trajectory being affected by space and where they are. There's maybe an argument that because of China's size or because of the socialist period and the legacies of the socialist period, it may be there's something a bit different there. It's not like every country is the same in this, but I'm not suggesting that there's some sort of unique problem to China. I think one of the things that makes, if you were thinking sort of comparative histories of spatial inequality, one of the things that does make China interesting is the contrast between this pattern of where resources are being concentrated in the service of state developmentalist projects and the opposing impulse to equalize across space. Again, the most extreme example of that is in the Great Leap Forward, where there's really a few months where maybe five months, maybe from August of 1958 to the very end of the year, where looking at some of the local documents and local newspapers, very strong language of equalization, of rural industrialization. And then I suppose by the time of the wheat harvest of 1959, that has already changed. And really for the rest of the Great Leap Forward, it's more a question of keeping the concentration aspects of the Great Leap Forward going. In other words, almost abandoning the egalitarian impulses of the Great Leap Forward in the beginning and trying to keep the industrialization aspects going. And by 1960, that's meant trying to just keep the urban industrialization aspects of it going. And I suppose, in a sense, the demonstration there is that it proves impossible, really, to equalize and have massive economic growth purely on the basis of increasing the amount of labor inputs that you're putting in. And probably the thing that the book talks about most when it comes to the Great Leap Forward is the case of the urban communes. The very first of the urban communes of the Great Leap Forward were in Zhengzhou. It was the pioneering city, one of the most radical model cities of the Great Leap Forward. And these urban communes start with this impulse to equalization. It's bringing together villages near the city, connecting them to either urban cooperatives or state-owned enterprises, and trying to share resources and bring the two sectors of the economy together. That lasts for several months, and then it kind of disappears completely. And then by the time it comes back in 1960, these urban communes are really just about trying to grow enough food to avoid urban famine and to feed urban workers. And though nominally they're the same institutions, it really feels like a very different kind of impulse that really is about concentration rather than equalization. But that's not, that's an extreme example. It's not to say that nothing has changed. We could make a case that in the last 10 or 15 years, this city cluster strategy, I spent some time trying to do the maths and kind of work out whether the city cluster strategy was working in trying to spread resources out from the central city to the other cities in the cluster. I mean, you can sort of do the numbers whichever way you want. There may well be an argument that these city clusters are actually tending to suck in resources to the center rather than spread them out. But something has changed, even if the equalization isn't exactly working. By most measures, rural-urban inequality, regional inequality, even income inequality have been falling in the last 15 years, maybe 20 years or so, and the sheer resources at not just at the state's disposal, but at society's disposal compared to 15, 20 years ago means that, in a way, the stakes of this concentration equalization question have changed beyond recognition since the 20th century.
So I guess maybe one could even argue that the equalization is somewhat realized through making the center bigger by creating you sort of bring the cities into a central cluster. So there are more cities in the quote-unquote center. So the kind of concentration in a cluster means that there are more cities sort of share the kind of investment or capital or resources. So in a way, there is some level of equalization among the cities in the cluster, but not necessarily beyond the cluster.
That could be right. Especially where they're able to, create. This is probably true in most of the city clusters, but where they're able to create very rapid transport links.
Right.
Where there's kind of 8 cities all within about 45 minutes of each other. Maybe in a way the big question is a demographic question on the future of that. I think the demographic future of lots of not in every case, but of some sub-provincial industrial centres. I think the demographic future there is maybe it's very uncertain. I think how that's going to play out.
Right. Right. I guess we can move on to the next question, which kind of your starting point, actually, where you sort of talk about what sort of interests you from the very early on is this relationship between Zhengzhou and Kaifeng, and which is a recurring theme that we do see from chapter to chapter. We sort of talk about this evolving relationship. And I guess from your perspective, how do you see this relationship, right, in relation to the theme of the book? So how does the relationship between Zhengzhou and Kaifeng and the change of that really tell us about spatial politics in modern China?
There's a couple of things. I mean, the first and most obvious thing to say is that it really demonstrates how the urban hierarchy is a political one. That when the capital was moved in 1954, this is very much, part of the rhetoric around it is about moving the capital slightly so it's nearer the middle of the province. But it's also about making a political statement, really condemning Kaifeng as a backward, a city of luxury, a city of consumption, a city of kind of Fengjian, old feudal city, an old capital, and moving it to a more proletarian industrial centre. And in a way, what's most startling is really the fate afterwards. And this maybe is the second thing that it tells us, is that the hierarchy of cities is not only political, also becomes very entrenched quite quickly and very hard to shift. So Kaifeng is one of. There aren't many cities that do badly in both the socialist period and the reform period, but this is one of them, where there's a city that's first being criticised for not being proletarian enough is then criticised for not being entrepreneurial enough, or not being capitalist enough. And it's only relatively recent with the explosion of domestic tourism that's started to change. But still, it's very entrenched hierarchy. I mean, when I started doing the PhD research about 10 years ago, the disposable income between these two cities, people in Kaifeng were basically half as rich as those in Zhengzhou. That's changed now, partly because of the incredibly rapid growth of housing costs, as in lots of provincial capitals, but it's still very striking. The third thing it makes me think about is this question about, and this is another thing that I was too diffident, or I was too shy to talk about in the book, which is it's a whole book about inequality, but it doesn't really talk about how people think about inequality. And what the cultural aspects of this are. And a couple of people who've read the book have emailed me to make this point. Like, do people care? Does it matter? In what sense has inequality been internalized or naturalized? And this is maybe an example that's got me thinking about that recently, which is it's now 70 years since the provincial capital was moved in Henan province. But from talking to people in Kaifeng, and maybe it's skewed by, because I mostly talk to historians, but there is a sense that the reduced status of the city has been kind of internalized, but not exactly naturalized, in the sense that this is very sort of amateurish, but this sense that there was that the city of Kaifeng was stripped of its status that it had for, I don't know, 800 years, maybe more, and that this wasn't really a natural thing to do. There's still a sense of, I think, still a sense of resentment or something having been lost in the city, and even if that's now 70 years later, it's been very much internalized, that this is the fate of the city. Still not. People still, I think, certainly older people in the city still aren't completely happy with it, still not completely naturalized as how things should be. So maybe that's a kind of snapshot of the sense that in lots of, this is very sort of pop sociology, but lots of international comparative studies of inequality show that show that people in China are perhaps a bit more relaxed about inequality than other places. It depends whether you're asking about income or asking about wealth. Depends whether you're asking about inequality due to look or inequality due to performance or merit. It really, I think, it depends how you're asking the question. And I think asking questions about inequality in China often has a sort of whiff of political extremism or cultural revolution about it. I think it's a very difficult thing to test, and all sorts of people have come up with different suggestions of this. But I think this maybe points to an example where there's certainly awareness of inequality and unfairness, but and this is something that people in Kaifeng have learned to live with and things, and in the tourist sector have learned to embrace the rich past of the history, but still not maybe entirely comfortable with living with it.
Yeah, sounds like you can work with social scientists on this.
Yeah.
Right. So my last question. So those of you in the audience have questions, please get yours ready. My last question is about this attention to the urban edge or the rural-urban fringe zone that you also spend quite a lot to talk about in the book, which I also appreciate because I always find the Chengxiang-Jiehebu is the most interesting part about Chinese cities. So I guess from you, in terms of your attention to this particular zone or area of the city, what do you find particularly interesting or important? Why is it important to pay attention to these urban edges or the rural-urban fringes?
Yeah, actually, the reason I wanted to write about it in the first place was that the rural-urban edges were so prominent in studies of contemporary China, particularly when I was starting in the 2010s, maybe. It's very sort of high-stakes questions about land, expropriation, accumulation, corruption, local state finances. There was all this stuff sort of swirling around. And I was struck by how little historical writing there was on the rural-urban edge, apart from, a kind of older historiography thinking trans-historically about city walls. But it didn't seem to me to be very much about thinking about what the edge of the city meant in the 20th century. A little bit on Shanghai, but not very much on other cities. So actually I was starting off with a kind of descriptive question of what was the edge of the city like. And I think this is one of the things that is wrong with the book. Maybe this is useful for anyone who's sort of writing a book or writing a dissertation. My idea was that the introduction is for telling people, and then the chapters are going to show them, right? But actually, I think probably what I should have done a bit more of in the book, looking back, is doing a little bit more precise telling in the chapters. Don't know if you felt that reading it. I felt like the introduction sort of tells you everything, and then the chapters show it, but there isn't perhaps quite a close enough connection in the book between the two. And I think one of the things I probably should have done a bit more is done a bit more to tell the reader more precisely how to analyse or how to think about the rural-urban edge at particular moments in particular chapters. Because we've been talking thematically, but the book is structured very boring history chronology. And actually, I think it can be quite difficult, particularly for a reader who's not sitting down to read the whole book, right? I think it can be quite difficult to grapple with individual chapters as you go along. Anyway, I think what probably I should have been a bit more precise about with the question of the rural-urban edge in the chapters is thinking about how some of the questions of China, contemporary China or China in the 2010s, have got these older historical resonances. One of the examples that I might have pushed on there is the questions of inequality and the building of industry at the edge of the city. So the example here is at the end of the 1910s, there's a huge cotton mill, a spinning mill built at the edge of what is then. Now it's the middle, right? But back then it was the edge of Zhengzhou, and there's in a sense a real striking. It's a class inequality that's particularly marked at the urban edge between what is the 1920s, a kind of managerial class of people from the lower Yangtze, of migrant workers. And then villages on the edge of the city in the 1920s that have still got some fields, but are also providing kind of low-level services to industrial workers. And that's very similar, really, to the building of, has some similarities with the building of socialist industry in a new edge of the city, in the west of the city in the 1950s, where there's really I suppose a three-layered hierarchy of skilled workers, lots of even at that time, even in the 1950s, of temporary rural workers, and villages which have lost in the 1950s have lost some of their land, but probably kept the village housing and are really trying to survive on the edge of the urban and rural sectors. And this has obviously as many people will know, the edge of city industry now is the huge Foxconn, the iPhone plant, where there's some of the same hierarchies of existing villagers and migrant workers, and then a sort of technical managerial class from outside. So, I mean, the book doesn't really talk about class very much or enough, but that's one of the examples where the starkness of inequalities, I think, can be seen at the urban edge, and what happens to nearby villages as the city expands. And there's a bit of, I mean, it's kind of, sometimes think about this, certainly in the last 40 years or so, as a kind of lottery, the fate of villages around the city is a kind of lottery of space and time, where they are, when they are, and the kinds of compensation that they get, the kind of absorption into the city, the kind of training, the kind of opportunities, vary really very wildly depending on where they are and when that happens. And then even as I was living in the city and doing the research, lots of the kind of Zhengzhou demolition was having very different effects in different places to migrants, the original villagers, and urban people. So, this is not a kind of, lots of people have written about this in contemporary China, but I thought it was interesting to give it a bit more of a historical look.
Yeah, which kind of ties to the earlier points about how space does make a difference, right, to how these things work. Yeah, I think just to add to what you just said, what I found particularly interesting, a point you made, or a case I guess you mentioned, is this how, despite class-wise, the migrant workers and the villagers, that they are quite similar in terms of their class or I guess income level. But then because that kind of spatial differentiation, that the villagers who are the ones who are renting rooms or houses out to migrant workers, that they sort of see themselves are hierarchically quite different from the migrant. Like there's less, I guess, sort of you talked about, there's not really a kind of class-wide solidarity in there because of these particular spatial differentiations, which, again, sort of like relates to this issue of how you see the kind of spatial inequality manifest in the urban edge, which I find is extremely interesting.